Perfect. Now, I have the absolute great pleasure of introducing our guest speaker this afternoon, Michael Scott, Professor in Classics and Ancient History at the University of Warwick, but I'm sure he needs no major introduction from me. Most of you will already be familiar with Professor Scott's work, being the author of several books on the ancient Mediterranean world. And of course, he's written and presented a range of TV and radio documentaries for the BBC, for ITV, for National Geographic and the History Channel as well. I could go on listing all of Professor Scott's accolades, but I know that you'd much rather hear from our guest speaker instead. So without further delay, Belfast Classics is absolutely delighted to welcome Professor Scott, and he's going to present his lecture today, as you can see on your screen, on the bigger ancient world. So thank you, Professor Scott.
Thank you so much, Kerry, and thank you to you all for taking the time. I don't know what the weather is like with you in Belfast this afternoon, but we have a very unusual, given the recent weather, very hot, sunny afternoon here in Oxford, where I am at the moment. And so I'm very pleased if you've got anything similar in terms of weather, that you are still willing to share this time with me on Zoom. And I'm just so sorry not to be able to sort of be over with you, but I hear, absolutely fantastically how brilliantly the online course and summer school has been going, how much you have all been doing absolutely incredible work, and what fantastic enthusiasm and energy there is for learning the wonderful ancient languages of Latin and Greek over the past 2 weeks. So congratulations to you, thank you to you, and it is a huge pleasure and privilege to be with you. I wanted to talk on a subject which I know is dear to my heart, and I know it's dear to a number of you in the Belfast Classics community, and that's thinking about the bigger picture, the bigger ancient world, and to introduce to you a text that I'm absolutely 100% sure you will never be shown in any kind of language learning class, and we'll talk about why that might be in a second. But it's a text that really, when I first came across it, really expanded my sense of what the ancient Greeks conceived of, the ancient Greeks and the Romans of the 1st century AD conceived of as the bigger ancient world of which they were just a part, and how they were located and sort of fixed into it, and how they were trying to ultimately make a profit and a living out of it. And I wanted to sort of just highlight with you, the short time that we've got, some of the aspects of the text in translation, so that we can kind of begin to unravel what it tells us about that much bigger ancient world. Now, this text is called the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. Now, many of you will be able to sort of deal with a sort of periplus, that kind of journey around idea. And this was a favorite kind of travel handbook thing, the periplus, that was written. Lots of different peripluses were written in the ancient Greek world. There's periplus of the Black Sea, there's periplus of the Erythraean Sea, there's peripluses everywhere. The Greeks seem to, particularly the Greek travel writers and Greek kind of geographers, liked these travel around texts. And they are very much handbooks for travel. This isn't so much a kind of rough guide to, when you're in this town, make sure you go and see X, Y, and Z. These are really handbooks to go say, right, you're at this place, now continue X number of stades, miles in this direction, and you get to this place, and this is what you can buy and sell at this place, and see it, and then move on to the next. So they really are practical handbooks that were in some ways meant to be kind of real aids on the journey, actually getting you from A to B to C and onwards. And the one we're looking at today is the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. Now, we can visualize it, and hopefully this helps put it into context of the area that we're talking about, and why immediately you can see this text helps us get into that bigger ancient world. Now, for the ancients, for the Greeks and for the Romans, the Erythraean Sea was anything really east of what they called Erythra, which was the Red Sea. So anything coming down from modern-day Egypt, of course, the Roman territory of Egypt at this stage, from ports that you can see there like Myos, Homos, or particularly Berenice, coming down through the Red Sea, out then into what we know as the Indian Ocean, but to them was the Erythraean Sea. And the Periplus is a series of trade routes that could be explored and were explored by this stage in the 1st century CE on a regular basis. Now, what we know from a number of different ancient writers is that sometime in the 1st century BCE, a trader called Hippalus was the first to discover how to get across the Indian Ocean and to India, not by hugging the coast of Arabia and then through kind of across and then down and round India, but actually by crossing the open ocean, by using the monsoon winds, which take you in one direction at one particular time of the year. And then, of course, if you catch them at the right time, they'll take you back in the opposite direction at another time of year in great speed. And once this knowledge had been gained by the Mediterranean communities, and we're told very specifically that that knowledge was already held by a number of the Arabian trading communities, but they weren't really letting on. They didn't want to let out their trade secret. Once the Mediterranean communities had got hold of it, and particularly the Roman traders had got hold of it, from the time of the Emperor Augustus onwards, there is a massive expansion in Roman trading that goes on, sailing down the Red Sea and then out in and into the Indian Ocean and across it to the ports of India. And so our writer of this text, and we don't have a name for the writer of this text, the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, seems to have been, from the language he uses, where he's very much talking about we do this and we go there and our ships, etc., must have been some kind of Greek merchant, writes in Greek, living in Egypt, most likely because, again, of some of the references to talking about the Egyptian port, probably of Berenice, where kind of he was based. In text-wise, date is not absolutely clear, but definitely 1st century CE, and people argue backwards and forwards about when exactly in the 1st century CE. But kind of by this time, a significant annual trading venture had been established that every year saw a fleet of, we're told by the writers, up to about 120 ships, Roman ships, leaving from Roman-controlled Egyptian ports down through the Red Sea and then out into the Indian Ocean to trade, particularly with all those sites that you can see dotted. So every site dotted on this map is somewhere that is referred to in the Periplus. And in the Periplus, it takes you on a number of different trading routes that you see here marked by the dots. So the first trading route that's contained in the Periplus comes down the Red Sea, out into the Indian Ocean, but then immediately turns south and runs down the east coast of Africa, down through to a place called Rapta. So that's kind of modern Dar es Salaam area, and talks about the different objects that can be picked up in a number of these different ports. And particularly in Rapta, for instance, you can imagine one of the goods that they talk about as being absolutely one of the big things they're picking up when they get there. It's ivory, but also turtle shell, and a number of other things. And what they seem to be bringing in, because this is a trade, they want to bring stuff to sell as well as buy stuff to take back then to sell on. They seem to be bringing in quite a lot of weaponry and to Rapta. So that's sort of journey number one in the Periplus. But then journey number two is taking us out across the Indian Ocean, first up, and you can see the dotted line diverging up to the northern port of Barragaza, and we'll have a look and see what the Periplus says about that in a second. And then equally, you can head straight down further south to, amongst other, the large port of Muziris. And then you can see the dotted line goes all the way round the south coast, southern tip of India, between India and Sri Lanka, and then up all the way around to the eastern side of the modern day border of India. And then we'll see at the end of this talk where the Periplus ends, and what the conception of the wider ancient world was. If we just go to a bigger map, if this wasn't big enough for you, let's go to a bigger map for a second, because this is the actual kind of bigger ancient world that by the 1st century CE we need to start thinking about, that the Mediterranean was well connected into. We've been looking at just that part of the Arabian Sea, the Indian Ocean, and through to India itself. But of course, we know that these trading networks that will become the early Silk Roads, both by land and by sea, are connecting up all the way through to the Han Kingdom of China by this stage. And many of you will be starting to think more and more, I hope, about how the Mediterranean world both affected and was affected by these much bigger and wider connections. And we'll come back to where these connective tissues are going and the sorts of impressions that the Romans had of the Chinese and the Chinese had of the Romans at the very end of this. Now, the reason you're never going to read the Periplus in any language teaching class is because, frankly, the Greek is awful. I absolutely love some of the sort of ill-disguised distaste that translators have for this text. This was a Greek trader writing it. He was no literary doyen. He's writing in very functional, sometimes very sort of Egyptian Greek, street Greek, we might call it, and kind of some of the great comments. If you ever want to sort of diss anyone's ancient Greek, you can say, as commentators have said of this text, they talk of its rude simplicity. There you go. Oof, that's harsh. Its indifference to grace, freedom, or variety of expression. So poor old writer, whoever his name was, this Greek trader in the 1st century CE who put this text together, he does not get top marks from his language tutor in any way, shape, or form. And so as a result, you're not going to be shown it as an example of the best Greek that's out there anytime soon. But it really is about what's in the text, what the text is trying to convey, that I think is so interesting for us and so rich. So let's go start thinking about one of those journeys that he talks about over to the coast of India, to the west coast of India. And let's think about where he is turning up first in Barragaza. Now, it's worth pointing out also, just before we get into what they're looking for and what they're able to pick up and sell and buy in Barragaza, that this is not in any way an organized Roman imperial venture, right? This is not something that the Roman state, part of the Roman in the imperial period, is doing itself. This is very much a kind of capitalist model in which the traders are individually taking on the risk and the potential reward of this venture. And we have documents surviving from the Egyptian ports of Berenice and Mykonos, which are documents like insurance documents for the ship and kind of for the ships that will go on this venture. Because if they manage to return fully laden, there's a massive profit. Of course, if they're lost at sea or something happens to them en route, and there are lots of pirates, we know that's talked about in the Indian Ocean, then there is a huge loss involved. The traders are taking on this loss and potential reward themselves. And where the state is benefiting, where Rome benefits, is the fact that they tax the goods that come back. So when the goods arrive back in Egypt, they're being brought from India, they are being taxed when they arrive into Roman Egypt and Berenice, and then they're also being taxed again when they leave Roman Egypt, normally through the port of Alexandria, as you can see on this map, and then dotted going off to the different sites around the Mediterranean. And this was an extremely profitable and low risk effort for the Romans, where they got lots of tax money in for all of these wonderful goods. And really the amounts of money we're talking about are staggering. In terms of what, if a fully laden ship got back from this journey, it actually was worth. We're talking about the sort of money that you needed to qualify to be a Roman senator, for instance, right? Kind of it's massive mega bucks for the individual traders and mega tax bucks for the Roman state. And it's no surprise, it's no coincidence that it's in the 1st century CE, after this annual trading route really gets going, that you see the Roman Empire starting to do so much more, both in terms of military expansion, in terms of architectural building, in terms of stamping its authority around the Mediterranean. They've just got more money to be able to do so, a lot of which is coming through this trading route. So what does our poor Greek merchant who can't write Greek very well have to say? So here we are. This is in section 39 of the text, and he's talking about Barbaricum. So sorry, if we just go back very, very briefly. Oh, hang on a sec. Let's see if we can go back. Here we go. We need to talk about Barbarum, which is, you can see it right up there in the northwest coast of India in a green circle, Barbarum. So almost as if you've taken a diversion, you've got across the Indian Ocean, then diverted back up north. That's the first stopping point, Barbarum. Then we'll go to have a look at Barragaza. And this is what it tells us. The ships lie at anchor at Barbarum, but all their cargoes are carried up to the metropolis by the river to the king. There are imported into this market a great deal of thin clothing and a little spurious, figured linens, topaz, coral, storax, frankincense, vessels of glass, silver and gold plate, and a little wine. On the other hand, there are exported costus, bdellium, lycium, nard, turquoise, lapis lazuli, ceric skins, cotton cloth, silk, yarn, and indigo. Now, we don't need to know what all of these things are, and actually there are huge debates about what certain objects actually are in these descriptions. But the first thing you need to know is the incredible richness and variety of goods that are available coming out of this one port, both in terms of what the Roman traders are seeking to pick up and what they're bringing in and what they know the market, particularly here at Barbarum, wants to buy from them. And there is this clear, very clear sense of what is popular in particular ports and what they can get from particular ports. And notice the variety of objects and the wealth of objects, the expense of individual objects. This is not a trade in big, relatively inexpensive per unit items. It just wouldn't make financial sense to be shipping that backwards and forwards at huge cost. What they're interested in are smaller, lighter, much more expensive luxury goods, right? That's what this trade is really focused on. Things like lapis lazuli, ceric skins, the Seres, the silk people, so some connection with those from China, being called the Seres, the silk people in this text. Silk yarn, we can see again, silk coming from different sources in India, but mostly and mainly coming from China, as well as different dyes, and of course gold, silver and glass. So lots of different things coming in at Barbarum. And then if we move down the coast towards Barragaza, and now this is, again, I kind of like the way this text layers a bit of history in for us here. We don't need to know about the country of Ariaka or at the beginning of the kingdom of Nambanas, but it shows some awareness from this Greek trader of these different other ancient communities and ancient empires. But it says this: in these places there remain, even to the present time, signs of the expedition of Alexander, such as ancient shrines, walls of forts, and great wells. So here, of course, we're referring to something that had happened now, end of the 4th century BCE. We're in the 1st century CE, so several hundred years earlier, an awareness that Alexander the Great had, of course, marched with his armies all the way through the Persian Empire east to the borders of the River Indus in India and expanded his kingdom, which then, of course, after Polyphostes' death, became the Hellenistic world with the different Hellenistic kingdoms governed by his generals. And then, of course, that was in part being swallowed up by the Roman Empire, and in part had been taken over by different kind of native empires that were on and off enemies of Rome. And yet here, there's a sense that when you come to India, you can still see the ancient relics of the expedition of Alexander. Now, Barragaza, that's quite far south in terms of whether they're from the era of Alexander or from the subsequent period, the Hellenistic world, when we know this area of the country was sort of populated by the so-called Indo-Greeks, Indo-Greek kings, this sort of weird cultural mix of native Indian communities with the Greeks living in Central Asia across the Hindu Kush and developing small mini kingdoms that the history of which is very, very hard to track, although we get some success through coinage. So whether this really is Alexander or whether it's from those later periods of Indo-Greek kings, we can't necessarily be sure. There's a wonderful sense of history of how the Mediterranean peoples have been here before. Then, of course, what do we get out of Barragaza? And the list is even longer and more interesting, I think, in many ways. So if we quickly have a look through it, there are imported into this market town wine, Italian preferred, also Laodicean and Arabian. Now, that first sentence I find extraordinary. Right? Just imagine what that means. In Barragaza, there is a liking for not just Mediterranean wine and that from Asia Minor, that's Laodicea, and Arabian wine, right? There is a specific preference for what kind of Mediterranean wine that they prefer in the port of Barragaza in India. And it's Italian wine they prefer. So the Greek wine doesn't get a look in. What's changed? And it's Italian wine they want. And then also from Laodicea in Asia Minor, and Arabian wine. There is absolute specificity of desire. They know enough about the different wines that are possibly being traded around for them to have a preference. Then there's copper, tin, lead, coral, topaz, thin clothing and inferior sorts of all kinds, bright colored girdles, a cubit wide, storax, sweet clover, flint glass, realgar, antimony, gold and silver coin, on which there's a profit when exchanged for the money of the country. An ointment, but not very costly and not very much. And for the king, there are brought into those places very costly vessels of silver, singing boys, beautiful maidens for the harem, fine wines, thin clothing of the finest weaves, and the choicest ointments. So the king, controlling this area around Barragaza, has his own specific list of imports that these traders know that he wants and will buy, that are bringing in for him in particular. And then these are the things that they take, that they want from Barragaza, that they know Barragaza specializes in. There are exported from these places spikenard, costus, bdellium, ivory, agate, cornelium, lycium, cotton cloths of all times, silk cloth, mallow cloth, yarn, long pepper, and other such things as are bought here from the various market towns. Those bound for this market town from Egypt make the voyage favorably about the month of July. So you can see again, very specific needs, very specific wants and knowledge about what they can get in each of the different ports. Now, I realize that we need to speed up a little bit here so that we're not eating into our question time. Please do shout with any questions you've got in the chat, and we'll have about sort of 5-10 minutes, I think, to definitely have a conversation about this weird text and the world it opens up. But I wanted to also leave you with the kind of sense of the very end of the text. So we looked at that map, we looked at all those dots, and the text has something to say about the different ports, kind of all those dots. And then it gets around the southern tip of India, and it goes up the eastern coast of India, and then it sort of peters out. Right? And these are the final sections of the text of the Periplus as it gets to the very edge of this Greek trader with such rude simplicity of Greek language, the very end of his knowledge, or the combined knowledge that of the world that he's a part of what happens next. It says this: after this region under the very north, the sea outside ending in a land called Tis, there is a very great inland city called Tinai, China, which, and kind of it's very interesting, the derivations of our modern word China coming from Tina, which we think may well be a kind of westernized version of Qin Empire, the first unified empire of China. Although, of course, by this time, we're into the world of the Han Empire, the subsequent empire following on from Qin, from which, but they know, raw silk and silk yarn and silk cloth are brought on foot through Bactria to Barragaza, and are also exported to Demerisia by way of the river Ganges. So they're aware of how some of the goods, particularly raw silk and silk yarn, end up in the ports that they're buying them from. They realize they're not made there. They realize that they are being traded over great distances to get to those ports, to then be put on board those ships and taken back to the Mediterranean. And that is partly by land, as actually bringing them through Bactria, Central Asia, modern day Afghanistan, and then down towards the ports of Barragaza. But the land of Tis is not easy of access. Few men come from there, and seldom. The regions beyond these places are either difficult of access because of their excessive winters and great cold, or else cannot be sought out because of some divine influence of the gods. So this is where the idea of the concept of the world of the Periplus ends. But of course, over the next centuries, end of the first into the second, third, and fourth century CE, there will be not only developing geographical knowledge of this much wider ancient world, pushing ever eastwards to understand and conceptualize more about this land of Tis, of Tina, China, where the silk comes from, or the Seres, the silk people as they're called. But also there will be developing understandings of kind of what the people who live there are like. And if we can just take very, very briefly for a few more minutes, kind of what some of those people say. Now, you'll be very familiar with this map. I know it comes out, has a Belfast origin, but it gives you that sense there of the different empires that we're talking about, through to the Han Empire and the different kingdoms in between. Now, the Periplus writer thought that some influence of the gods stopped people from getting there, but we might also want to think about what stopped people from the Han Empire getting to the Mediterranean. And the answer in many ways is the Parthian realm that sat in between them. And if we go over to some Chinese texts from this period, particularly the Huanshu, the book of the later Han, it talks about this, says this: in 97 CE, so just at the end of the 1st century CE, Ganyang was sent to Daqin, which is how the Han Empire refers to the Roman world and the Mediterranean, Greater Qin, kind of a conceptualization of the Roman world being almost equivalent to the Han Empire in the east. He reached Tiaozi next to a large sea. He wanted to cross it, but the sailors of the western frontier of Anxi, Parthian Empire, said to him, "The ocean is huge. Those making the round trip can do it in 3 months if the winds are favorable. However, if you encounter winds that delay you, it can take 2 years. That's why all the men who go to sea take stores for 3 years. The vast ocean urges men to think of their country and get homesick, and some of them die." And when Gan Ying heard this, he gave up his plan. Now, it absolutely doesn't take 2 years from the Parthian Empire to sail to the Roman world. We get the sense here that the Parthians are elongating the distance in order to maintain their role as middleman and making a profit off it too, stopping the Chinese making direct contact with the Romans. And then the Huanshu goes on later to say this, kind of the king of this country, talking about the Rome, constantly desired to have diplomatic relations with the Han. But the Anxi, the Parthians, wanting to be the only trader of Chinese silks, opposed this plan and set up obstacles so that there could be no personal communication with China. And as a result, we think that actually face-to-face contact between the Roman world and the Han Chinese world was quite limited until we're getting into much later centuries, particularly into the 4th century. With the Parthians keeping in the way. But that doesn't mean that they didn't have ideas about what each other was like. And to end with this, a couple of different examples. So the Huanshu again, and this is what the Han thought about the Romans, and particularly their kings, their emperors. Their kings are not permanent. If there are unexpected calamities in the kingdom, he is unceremoniously rejected and replaced. The one who has been dismissed quietly accepts his demotion and is not angry. Yeah, right. That's the story we know about Roman emperors, isn't it? The people of this country are tall and honest. They resemble people of the Middle Kingdom, i.e. China, and that is why the kingdom is called Daqin, Great China. There's this sense very much that we get in the Chinese sources of them setting up the Roman world as a sort of almost more perfect, in many ways, equivalent of their own world. They know their problems that they have, but in this Daqin world, those things don't happen. Rulers who have been dismissed quietly accept their demotions and aren't angry. And what do the Romans think about the Han? Well, they talk about the Seres, come between the two, the Indians to the south and the Scythians to the north. They're a race eminent for integrity and well known for the trade which they allow to be transacted behind their backs, leaving their wares in a desert spot. So there's this wonderful kind of mutual appreciation society going on between these two empires. Don't have much direct contact, but seem to think each other rather splendid. And then, of course, we get the sense of all the problems that their goods, and particularly the silk goods, bring to Rome. Because while the Roman world wanted all these goods, as you'd be well aware, I'm sure, we're kind of thinking about how silk is reacted to within the Roman world. For women wearing it and for men wearing it, it causes a bit of a problem for Roman virtue and manliness. And Pliny has this complaint to make. He says, "So manifold is the labor, and so distant are the regions of the globe drawn upon to enable the Roman maiden to flaunt transparent clothing in public. The Seres are of inoffensive manners, yet resemble wild animals in that they shun all intercourse with the rest of mankind and await the approach of those who wish to traffic with them." So that double sense that kind of they might not be as great as all that, particularly given the problems their goods are causing us. So there we are. Hopefully that gets you a little bit interested in the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea and what it has to say, if not from a linguistic point of view, then certainly from a content point of view, and opens up again that much wider ancient world, which I think we constantly have to remind ourselves the Greeks and Romans and the Mediterranean was only ever one particular part. Thank you very, very much indeed.
Wow, thank you for that. That was excellent. And I can see the questions are coming in already. If people would like to unmute themselves and ask Michael a question directly, I'm sure we can have that as well. But otherwise, I'll start off with some of the questions that have appeared in the chat box, some of the early birds who've got in there quite quick with some queries. So an anonymous one here, which was kind of along the same thread that I was thinking about, having just taught beginners Greek this afternoon. What linguistic mistakes or missteps did the author make in the Periplus?
So it's a double feedback coming. There we go. Okay. Oh, that seems better. Yeah. So it's a couple of different things. Firstly, it's clearly kind of Egyptian influenced Greek. So the kind of this guy is not speaking or writing the kind of high Greek that we might come to expect. And so it's a grammar. It's actually mistakes in grammar. It's a lack of variety in sentence structure. It's a vocab difference as well. And simply kind of doesn't seem to be very interested. I think also it's a reaction to the fact that this is not a text that's interested in more flowery, descriptive adjectives, adverbs, all of that kind of stuff that we might expect from some of the, if we're reading an epic text or if we're reading a dramatic text, or indeed equally a kind of philosophical or indeed historical text to the Greek. This is kind of imparting information as brief and as concise. I mean, I think you get a bit of a sense even from the translation, don't you, as well? Kind of, it's like bam, 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 bam. These are the things you need to know. This is the detail. This is the data. So yes, I don't think you're probably going to be using it, Kerry, anytime soon in your teaching classes. But maybe a sentence or two you can sort of bring in at some point, so people can look at it and go, tut, tut, tut. What rude simplicity that this is composed of.
Yes, my curiosity is definitely peaked now. Okay, a few more questions coming in. Pauline, how did the Greek or Roman fleets traverse the area where we now have the Suez Canal?
Yeah, great question. So what would happen there? So they put in, before where the Suez Canal is, ports of Berenice and Moiosomos, so that's kind of coming up in the Red Sea. And then what seems to have happened is there was an early version of the Suez Canal, and this is particularly from the time of Trajan onwards, but we know earlier versions were operating, in that there was another fake kind of artificial canal that was then connected sort of directly westwards inland to the Nile. And then the goods would then be transported up the Nile and then through the Nile Delta through to Alexandria, where they'd be put on again ocean-going ships to then be taken out across the Mediterranean. And so if you are in, and in the level, it's part remains of where that canal connects into the Nile are in modern-day Cairo. So you can actually visit one of the sort of the surviving parts of the fort that Trajan built to defend and protect the connecting point between the canal and the Nile, has actually today built on top of one of the turrets of that fort is an Orthodox Greek church in modern day Cairo. So yes, you can, they did have a version of the Suez Canal, it just wasn't where the Suez Canal is.
Fantastic. Yeah, it's always great to think about the archaeological evidence as well that supports our literary evidence and to make those connections there. Christopher asks, was there also a slave trade along these routes? Thinking particularly of Axum and the East African coast.
So we hear a little bit in some of those segments that I pointed out to you, didn't know, that there are transport of people going on. Think about what's being brought for the king at Barragaza, the wives for the harem, but also the boys. So I have to imagine, and I think that's absolutely the case, that there is kind of a slave trade of some sense going on apart from it. But again, think about what traders are most interested in, what is low cost, high profit for them to be able to transport. So they want stuff that is high value, but not going to take up a lot of room and not going to need a lot of effort to be able to get it necessarily from place to place. So while they might be interested in specific deliveries of specific kinds of individuals, like we saw for that king at Barragaza, I don't think this would ever have become the way in which they would have done anything on the mass scale of slave trading, because it just wouldn't have actually added up for them in terms of all the other much more luxurious, much more expensive, much more easy to transport, much less space taking up items that they could go for instead.
Excellent. Fantastic. Gosh, there's so many questions coming in. Did the Roman state maintain a Red Sea navy, in part to protect the valuable trade with the East from piracy? I know you mentioned piracy as part of your presentation.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because to what extent did the Romans officially get involved to kind of protect what was going on? Particularly given when you think about where they're sailing, actually, particularly when they come out of the Red Sea and out into the modern day Indian Ocean, they're going past areas that are not necessarily always under their control, right? So there are difficulties, particularly in those eras when there is conflict between the Roman world and the Parthian world to the east. Now, we don't know to what extent there was a kind of a fleet in that sense, sort of sailing, protecting. I suspect there definitely were soldiers available in the area and some kind of military presence, but mixed in just again with that trading presence. And I think if we kind of reflect the parallel with what we know happened on the land border between the Romans and the Parthians, there you've got, on the one hand, you've got a very much more military outpost, place of Zeugma, kind of as a crossing point between these two worlds. But then you've also got, in the desert, you've got a trading caravan city of Palmyra, which doesn't have really any kind of permanent military presence in the same way. And so I think there's that mix. And then the third element is that people who are living in this border zone get very good at actually moving across the borders one way or another. And we see this particularly from the Palmyrene inscriptions on land. So the honorific inscriptions that are set up for those who have benefited Palmyra in one form or another. And they are constantly talking about people who are coming from cities across the border in a foreign realm, being honored by the Palmyrenes, or Palmyrenes who are getting good receptions and have good contacts in these cities across the border. So I think for people living in this border zone, there was a greater ability to move across it backwards and forwards than we might imagine. But at the same time, a mix in of some military protection for if things got particularly difficult.
A really good question here coming in now. Did the Periplus discuss what languages the natives spoke and how best to conduct business with them via translators, etc.?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question, isn't it? I'm trying to think of whether across the text there's an example of discussion of languages. It seems it is definitively assumed through the Periplus that communication is entirely possible. So when one of the earlier bits about Barragaza, for instance, it talks a lot about how difficult it is to navigate the particular waters coming into the port. Then unless you are a local, you'll beach the ship because there's all sorts of problems. So there's actually a pilot system at the port of Barragaza where a local, very kind of local captain will come on board your ship as the pilot to guide it in to the port, because they need that local knowledge to be able to do so safely. So there's clearly a lot of communication and regular kind of contact. Now, whether that's happening through translators who also kind of posit themselves in the port, that might well be the case. It might well be that some of the traders on board are specifically picking people for their crew who have experience of these languages. But I suspect it's a mix of both of those. And if we think of a parallel elsewhere, I'm thinking about the ports up on the Black Sea. So when we talk about the Periplus, the Black Sea, written by Arrian, we know that on the eastern coast of the Black Sea, and then just slightly further inland, there are a number of major trading emporia that are sort of the end point for the early Silk Road travel routes coming from the east. And when the Romans go there, they go to these traveling sites, and there are literally hundreds of different tribes speaking hundreds of different languages converging. And they talk about, the ancient sources talk about the need for up to 100 different translators to be able to actually work across all the different languages that are required to enable all of that trade. So I suspect it's a bit of a mix of people on the ships that are specifically brought there who have some knowledge of the languages, translators available kind of in the area, and the people working in the ports having some rudimentary ability to communicate directly with the Romans as well.
One more from Raoul coming in. Why do you think this particular trade, Periplus, was preserved?
Yes, so the story of this text is weird. It's basically shoved into Arian. And so preserved in one of the manuscripts with Arian. So we then and for a long time, people thought that this was written by Arian, wasn't it, as well? But we don't think that anymore. And I think it's one of those kind of almost accidents, to be honest, in terms of why this is preserved, because it gets into a manuscript and then sort of stays with us. I don't know what your thoughts are, Roel, as well about this. It'd be really interesting to hear. But we know it is one of many that are being written, because if you think about it, these are the key texts that people who are actually traveling to these places need to be able to get there. There aren't maps, as we've been looking at these maps today, that conceptualize it in this visual form, so you can go, okay, right, I know I just have to travel north now with my compass, etc., all of that. You needed a written map that took you from place to place, giving you distances and directions each time. And these maps exist both for sea travel and they exist for land travel as well.
Yeah, that ties into Tracy's next question, which is asking, how would this have been used and circulated? But, there were other texts and other similar items also being used, and presumably it was quite a competitive market as well, with so many different versions on the go.
Yeah, I mean, it would be interesting, wouldn't it? It would be lovely to have some competing versions here to go oh, what did they think? Who relied on this text and who relied on that one. I suspect these are, again, thinking about the methods of actually publishing this text and making it available. Someone writes it, a trader perhaps is kind of using it themselves, but then kind of is paid to get some copies written out to be able to offer to other trading vets or merchants, or if he has, or the person kind of controlling the ship has a number of ships, perhaps he pays to have a number of copies made to make available. Or perhaps there's a sort of scenario where these things are held back in Berenice as well, kind of for people kind of to consult as and when they need. We don't have all the answers in terms of how these texts are used and circulated. We'd love to know more, I think. But yeah, absolutely fantastic question.
And one more from one of our fabulous Greek students there, Oisin. Could you recommend a translation that's available for the Periplus?
Yeah, so the one I've taken from you today is quite an old one. It's sort of J.W. McCrindle, who is the chap who is going on about the rude simplicity of the Greek. But there are a number of different translations, including available kind of online. So do kind of shop around a little bit and kind of do think of that poor. I think we should think favorably of this Greek merchant who, sometime in the 1st century CE, thought it appropriate and necessary and worthwhile to put down his thoughts on what you could get at all these places, because I think it is crucially that eye opener for how much, even by the 1st century CE, which is way before people really start to talk about the early Silk Road routes and roads being fully kind of functioning, the Roman Empire was benefiting hugely from this trade, particularly through to India.
I think that's all the questions so far. Does anybody else want to offer a question or any comments that they'd like to make?
There's
can
some
unmute
great chat
yourselves.
about what makes Italian wine.
Yes,
Different from
yes.
anywhere else,
That's
like
always
going
good.
on in the chat. I'm particularly enjoying that one. And kind of, yeah, if anyone can compare between Italian, Laodicean, and Arabian wines for us, and sort of knowing whether this king had a particular tipple for the sweeter or the drier palate, I think that's absolutely kind of priceless for him to understand and go like, no, 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 only Italian and Laodicean will do. How little has changed.
Would anybody else like to ask anything or add their comments? Now is the time. You can feel free to unmute. Got some great feedback for you, saying great presentation, fantastic lecture, really enjoyable. So John is asking a question, why did the Chinese not make more of an effort to contact the Romans?
Well, I mean, in some ways, they make more effort than the Romans do for quite some time. I mean, there is no kind of official Roman embassy, that we see, like that one that I talked about when Yan Yin was asked in 1970. He was sent on an official embassy to try and make contact. Raoul will talk to you about the story from the kind of fantastic, from about the time of the rule of Marcus Aurelius, so in the second half of the second century CE, when we hear in the Chinese sources that some Roman traders or potential kind of ambassadors from the Roman Empire do rock up in China, but fabulously they sort of bring objects that the emperor looks at and goes, well, this is a load of rubbish. I thought you guys had good stuff over in Rome. And so kind of perhaps kind of put him off trying any further. We hear about, I mean, one of the things, the sources that I absolutely love is in the era of the Emperor Augustus. So kind of, we're talking early on in this sort of brave and ever broadening new world. He's receiving ambassadors on a fairly regular basis from India, and they turn up with goods, and he's in Greece at the time when he receives these ambassadors and these goods, and so the Greeks are kind of watching and seeing all these people and these goods arriving, and that includes in Athens in, I think it's 2021 BCE, kind of a Buddhist monk coming from India, supposedly setting himself on fire in front of an absolutely amazed Athenian audience who can't understand what he's doing or why he's doing it. And then the tomb of this Buddhist monk was visible in Athens, we're told, for kind of centuries afterwards. So, an extraordinarily large world that to some differing extents, the Greeks and Romans living in the Mediterranean were aware of and could conceive of.
And I think if you don't mind, there's one more question that's just come in. So I think we'll end on that note. The east coast of Egypt has never been known for its vast forests. Does the text address the size, design, or origin of the trading ships? Were they of Roman design, for example?
Good question. No, there's nothing in the Periplus about the ship design itself. And I think the excavations that have been coming out of Berenice in particular are kind of utterly fascinating, as you say, in matching up that archaeological evidence with these literary sources to help us understand kind of the size and scale of the operation and where stuff is coming from, to be able to kind of put all this together. And I think kind of keep your eyes peeled on those excavation reports coming out for kind of answers to these types of questions.
I think we've grilled Professor Scott sufficiently. I think he deserves a break after all of that, after such a fantastic presentation and answering all those really varied and fantastic questions. There really was. I'm delighted with the feedback. So I would just like to take this opportunity to thank Professor Scott for attending and being our guest speaker this afternoon. It absolutely was a pleasure, and I can see from the comments, everybody, not just myself, but everybody enjoyed this talk. It was informative, and it was something different. We really, really enjoyed it. So thank you again to Professor Scott. I can see the virtual claps are going up there, so that's fantastic. And finally, just to thank you all for coming. Okay, guys, you have been stellar this week. The ones that are attending the summer school, to go from classes in the early afternoon to coming to talks in the later afternoon. It's just marvelous. Your stamina and your endurance is just remarkable. We're astounded as your tutors. So thank you all, and thank you to our guests who have attended today as well. People who are past students, maybe future students who have just come along just to hear the presentation today. So we will see you all tomorrow for class, and next week for the resumption of the lectures and the workshops as well. So thank you to everyone, and once again, thank you to our speaker this evening.
Thanks so much, Kerry, and good luck with the rest of the course, everyone. Have a wonderful summer as well.